Building these highly detailed radio-controlled models is a lot of fun, but almost as much as that, I also enjoy building some nice dioramas to display them in. Today I've got a very simple 3D printable garage design that I'll be showcasing, from the initial design to getting everything painted and detailed. A very easy process that ended up looking great, so let's go ahead and have a closer look. Hello everyone and welcome! I'm back again with another build video, though this time it's not of a vehicle, but rather a place to put one in. I actually started on this garage last year, getting the design completed and then getting everything printed, but it was only until more recently that I decided to finally blow the dust off of this project and get everything put together. Once I started to see this display coming together, I was more and more motivated to get this build finished up, or at least finished up to a point where I was ready to make a video on it, which of course brings us to what you're seeing today. I know I've posted quite a few pictures of this garage as it's been coming together over on our social media pages, which of course are linked below in the description if you'd like to give us a follow, but I'm really excited to finally be ready to showcase this to all of you in video form. Huge thanks of course to everyone who liked and commented on those prior posts. That too is definitely a source of motivation, and I'm glad to see so many of you interested in this project. Of course, for anyone looking to build one of these for yourself, I hope you find today's video helpful. Now, build is a bit of a strong word here, as there isn't really much assembly involved in getting this garage put together, as it pretty much comes off the 3D printer looking like this, ready for paint and detail to be added. I think having it be this way comes with both some advantages and disadvantages over having a bunch of individual pieces like you'd find in a kit or building something from scratch. I'll be talking more about that later on during the design process, but I thought it was worth mentioning. I can already hear the pounding of the keyboards of the purists and rivet counters insisting this isn't real model making, as having this much heavy lifting done by a 3D printer is something more akin to cheating, as if this hobby is some kind of competition. I don't know, maybe for some people it is and they see things that way. For me personally, this project was done in a way that I found enjoyable, affordable, and not too consuming of my time. Of course, hats off to all the scratch builders out there, but for those maybe not looking for a project that's quite as involved and who have already invested in a 3D printer, this is simply another option. Simply put, for those looking for a more basic project that can serve as a great backdrop for some of your highly detailed 1/24 scale radio control models, or static models, whether plastic or die-cast, I think this project will be worth some consideration. And of course, for anyone who just wants to see this garage come to life, I invite you all to sit back and enjoy, and without any further introductions, let's get started. So what I sort of had envisioned for this project was something in between a very intricate, handmade diorama using materials such as wood and styrene, and then some of the more prefabricated store-bought stuff and kits that you can buy. I wanted to try and make something that I could simply 3D print, splash on some paint, and fill with a bunch of accessories. I used Autodesk Fusion to create the design, though I imagine any CAD modeling software, including free and open source ones, would work just as well, if you'd like to try and design something similar yourself. Buildings like this are a great thing to design if you're new to 3D modeling, as it's not like anything here is particularly complex, basically just a large rectangle with a roof. Of course, I want the size of this garage to be accurate, so I collected some real-world measurements, which I could then reduce, so this garage will be roughly 1/24 scale. I also wanted to ensure that the garage would not be too large to fit on the print bed of the Creality K1 that I plan to print all of these pieces on. I decided that this garage would consist of 4 main pieces, 2 for the floor and walls, and then 2 for the roof. I'll later use dowel pins and glue to secure each set together, but these main pieces will all be 3D printed individually. From there I began modeling the garage using real-world photos as inspiration. Precise accuracy isn't really a concern here, I just want something that looks the part. I decided that I would have an overhead door on the one side where a vehicle could drive into, and then a pedestrian door on the opposite side. There will also be 2 windows. Some elements of this design may be thicker than what they would be in real life, such as the walls and roof. I did this to ensure that they would be plenty strong enough to not make this diorama too fragile, and then to also ensure that there will be no warping while they're being 3D printed. As you may be able to tell, during the design process, all of these wooden beams and walls were individual pieces, much like they would be in real life. However, towards the end of the design process, I combined all of these individual models together, resulting in this diorama requiring minimal assembly. This has the advantage of making the assembly process extremely simple, as, well, there really isn't much assembly to speak of. However, I think one disadvantage of doing it this way is that you have to be more careful when painting, as if this garage consisted of many individual pieces, they could all be painted separately prior to gluing everything together. Also, you kind of have to hope that there aren't any issues during the 3D printing process, as with larger pieces like this, any sort of failure towards the middle or end of the print is going to result in a lot of waste. Although the inside is really going to be the main focus, I did go ahead and add some details to the exterior as well. It's just a simple garage, so it's not like I really need to go full on Frank Lloyd Wright here with the architecture, but just kind of add enough detail so you know what you're looking at. Now for the overhead door, I did consider getting a bit more fancy by making it able to be rolled up and down just like the real thing, possibly using a bunch of small ball bearings. But I decided to keep things simple and just design a removable piece that can be held in place with some magnets. I included some very simple rails and a spring just to have something to look at, but again, not a huge amount of detail in this area or really anywhere in this diorama as a whole. Enough to know what you're looking at, but not getting to the point where I'm investing hours and hours into the design process alone. Also making sure that nothing will be too difficult to 3D print. But overall, just a very fun thing to design. Not nearly as technical as some of the functional RC components that you've seen me make previously. Stuff like this is really enjoyable to make, and it's not like I need to worry about the functionality of any of these components, it's simply all for looks. I did create some spots to place some magnets for the overhead door, and then I also made some holes that are the correct size for some 1x10mm dowel pins to be inserted, which will help keep everything lined up during the assembly. Now, after having the experience of 3D printing and building this garage, I have since gone back and made just a few minor tweaks here and there to the design, but fortunately everything went together very nicely. There were just a few minor improvements that I wanted to make. But after maybe a few hours spent on the design, it was finally complete. Again, not the most detailed I could have made it, but I think there's enough here that will result in a great looking finished model. Something I did was design this in a way that, if I wanted to, I could 3D print a second half, which would result in a fully enclosed 2-car garage like this. For now, I'm just sticking with the one half, which I plan to display on a shelf, but as you could see, there are holes for additional dowel pins to be placed, which can connect the two halves together. If somebody would be interested in having a second half to this diorama, let me know. It would probably make sense to go ahead and remove this doorway here, as I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense to have 2 pedestrian doors along this back wall, but I don't know, maybe I could add a window here or just leave it blank. You will of course find the STL files for this diorama over on our Patreon if you're interested in 3D printing one for yourself. I'll be sure to include a link below in the description. But as I said too, if you're interested in getting into 3D modeling and want to try designing your own garage, I would definitely recommend giving it a try, as it's a pretty easy thing to model, comprised of some pretty simple shapes, but of course you can get in there and start to add more and more detail to make it match whatever style you're going for. As I'm sure you can imagine, I was very eager to start getting these parts 3D printed and assembled, so let's move on to that process. Once the design work was complete, I needed to get everything 3D printed. The garage consists of 4 main pieces, each of which will fit nicely onto the print bed of the Creality K1 3D printer that I'm using. With not a single dimension on these pieces exceeding 210mm, this diorama should be printable on most standard-sized hobby-grade 3D printers. Some support structure was certainly needed, especially for the roof pieces, as I chose to print them with the roof facing up, where more support material is going to be necessary. Personally, I'd much rather use more support material to have a better looking finished part where any imperfections as a result of the supports is not visible, than try to save what may only amount to $1 or a few cents worth of filament. I'd much rather use more filament than have to spend more time filling, sanding, and smoothing out the finished parts, but to each their own. If you'll be 3D printing one of these garages for yourself, definitely make sure you're paying close attention to the placement of all of the supports to ensure that they're not going to be placed in an area that's going to be too difficult to remove. As long as you're careful when placing all of the supports, they shouldn't be too much of a pain to have to remove. Also, when printing large pieces like these, you have to try to avoid warping. Certain materials are going to be more prone to this than others. Also, having your 3D printer inside an enclosure where the temperature can be regulated can help with this as well. I guess those are some of the downsides of making everything consist of just a few larger pieces that are sort of prefabricated, if that makes sense, rather than being comprised of a bunch of smaller individual pieces that need to be assembled. More support material is required, and you kind of have to be careful with how you're placing all of the supports. Also, hopefully your 3D printer doesn't fail during the printing process. Both the rear pedestrian door and the overhead door consist of some separate pieces which will require some assembly, but everything else is ready to go just as you see here. I did my best to carefully remove all of the support structure and bore out the roughly 1mm size holes that those dowel pins will fit into, which will help both secure and align everything together. Already this garage is looking pretty cool, and definitely a good option if you don't want to have to do a bunch of assembly. I placed a 1/24 scale Buick GS inside, along with some 3D printed accessories, which you'll also find STL files for over on our Patreon along with this garage. We also have some physical kits of these items listed on our website if you don't have a 3D printer, but I just wanted to get an idea of how everything might fit and do a bit of daydreaming about what the finished garage is going to look like. Plenty of room in here for both a vehicle and some space to show off various accessories, maybe even add a figure or two. There's lots of possibilities here. Clearly though, some more work is going to be needed before it'll be ready for paint. The areas where it looks like the most work will be required are the underside of these roof pieces. At this stage, I was a little bit concerned with how the ceiling might look. You can see it's got sort of a stringy texture here, which isn't exactly ideal. This is the side that was facing down towards the print bed, and obviously with the support structure being underneath this area, it doesn't leave as nice of a surface as the upward facing roof. I was thinking about what I could do to hide this area. However, as it turned out, after everything was painted later on, I didn't end up doing anything to these sections other than just a bit of trimming and sanding wherever necessary, as I thought it just sort of blended in and didn't really look that bad. However, two things I thought of which could look nice if you wanted to take your diorama even further than what I'm doing here is simply cutting up some pieces of something like balsa wood or styrene and just placing them into these rectangular sections, covering up this unsightly texture. Another idea was basically doing the same thing, except with aluminum foil to replicate that shiny insulation you'll sometimes see in structures like this. Maybe consider hitting it with some matte clear if the foil is too shiny. Just a couple of ideas, but again, I didn't end up doing it here as it didn't really look that unsightly in the end, but if you wanted to take the detail up a notch, that might be something to consider. One area though that definitely needed some help was right here where this beam is quite thin and ended up breaking while removing the supports. I've since gone ahead and thickened this area of the design as well as made a few other tweaks and improvements after having the experience of putting one of these garages together. If you find yourself in a similar situation though, it is an easy fix. All I had to do was cut up a piece of styrene to the correct size and shape, and then used a mixture of super glue and baking soda to make a nice strong bond, which I could later sand down to match the rest of the model. From there, I moved on to doing some post-print finishing work and sanding. I'm by no means going for perfection here, as I could drive myself crazy trying to get everything perfectly smooth and show no evidence of being 3D printed, but I did want to spend some time removing stuff like this to try and improve the appearance as much as I can without going over the top. With both of these roof pieces looking good, I glued each together using some super glue and those 1x10mm dowel pins. Those pins help keep everything aligned correctly, and that super glue is plenty strong. I'll be gluing each roof piece together along with each wall and floor piece, but I won't be gluing the roof to the walls as I want it to be removable. After that glue dried and the pieces were secured together, it was time to spray on some high build automotive primer to try and smooth out the transition between those 3D printed layers without having to cake on the primer too thick. Once it dries, I'll be sanding it smooth. With that done, it was time to do the same thing with the floor and wall pieces, once again using those dowel pins for alignment and super glue to hold everything together. Some post-print finishing work was necessary on these pieces, but not as much as on the roof, as there aren't nearly as many overhangs here. Next, I got all of the parts for the overhead door printed and did any necessary post-print finishing work on them. I also glued in the 3mm magnets that will help hold the door in place. Those magnets do a great job of holding the door in place while still allowing it to be easily removable, and then those rail pieces will simply be glued to the wall after everything has been painted. Speaking of painting, at this point it was time to get all of these additional parts over to the booth. I sprayed some paint on the rails for the overhead door, and then I applied some primer to all of the remaining parts to help fill any lines left over from the 3D printing process. At this point, everything was looking pretty good. However, one area that I definitely wanted to try and improve was the floor. Despite quite a few layers of primer, you can still see artifacts left over from the 3D printing process. So what I decided to do here was simply mix up a bit of body filler that's been sitting on the shelf for many years now and try and work it into these lines. Sure, there is filler specifically designed for models and hobby projects such as this. However, it's a lot more expensive when you need to use a lot of it like I do here, and since I had some of this auto body filler on hand that's just drying out over on the shelf, I decided to try and put it to use here. It was a bit too thick to really work into those lines and make the floor smooth. However, I'm not really concerned with having a perfectly flat, smooth, uniform surface. If this garage floor has some damage or inconsistencies, I think it'll simply add to the realism of the finished model. As long as it's breaking up those consistent lines that were present earlier, I'll be happy. While waiting for that to harden, I started sanding the roof piece that I had primed earlier. I did a bit of sanding and identified any areas that I thought might still need some work. But like I said, I'm not going for perfection here. I'm not going to be able to completely eliminate all of the 3D printing artifacts, but I just spent enough time here to get it to a point where I was satisfied with how it looks. Once that was done, I could start painting. I picked out two sort of wood-colored spray cans that I had on hand and began applying the paint, focusing on the ceiling and the internal structure, as the exterior will be painted a different color. Just splashing on those two colors actually resulted in a pretty good looking result, especially considering the ceiling isn't really going to be the focal point of this diorama. Eventually, the Bondo is dry and could be sanded down. Not trying to make it perfectly smooth, but just sort of level it out a bit. I then moved on to sanding the primer on the remaining areas of the walls, both on the inside and outside. It definitely took some time, but eventually I was satisfied with how it looked, and I went ahead and put another coat of primer on the floor to cover up that Bondo. The primer looks close enough to concrete, so no further painting will be required on the floor, at least not from a spray can. I went ahead and masked it, along with the foundation going around the outside, so I could paint the inside walls with the same paint that I used earlier for the ceiling. With the paint on the roof piece now dry, I went ahead and masked off the inside that I wanted to remain looking like wood, and then sprayed the roof with some gloss gray paint. While that was drying, I once again moved back over to the other piece, and already it's looking a lot better with that paint, but I wanted to try and improve the detail even more. I wanted to go for more of an aged and rustic look, so I started by going around with some sandpaper and sanded down a few areas to reveal more of the darker brown paint underneath, and I also used a black wash to help darken certain areas and add some grime. Obviously, there's no real science or technique to what I'm doing here. I'm by no means a weathering expert, but all I did was water down some black acrylic paint, and I just sort of smeared it around until I eventually got something that looked like this. Now originally I thought I was going to paint the wall a different color than the wooden beams. That would look really cool, but would take quite a bit of time to do, and I was kind of liking this all wood look that it has currently. One thing I did want to do though was tone down that weathering just a bit by lightly spraying some more of that lighter brown paint over top. I ended up with what you're seeing here. I think this definitely looks better. You can still see some of that weathering showing through, but it's not nearly as dark and grimy as how it looked before. That primer makes for a good looking concrete floor, but it's definitely a lot more pristine and clean than what I had envisioned. So I once again watered down some black acrylic paint and began griming up the floor. This is where using that body filler really helps to add to the lifelike look of this diorama, as that black wash sort of accentuated all of the inconsistencies and little cracks and depressions. Also, I added some oil stains and oil drips there in the middle. Considering most of the vehicles that I plan on displaying in here are going to be older vehicles, that seemed pretty accurate. Obviously more of a weekend warrior, blue-collar sort of vibe with this diorama here, versus something like that multi-million-dollar high-end race shop look that I've showcased previously with this project. But even at this stage, I was really happy with how it was turning out, and I decided to remove all of the masking from the roof piece and see how everything was looking put together. There's still much more to do, especially on the exterior, but already I was happy with how this diorama was progressing, and I was certainly excited to see it complete. Now for the exterior, I decided to just use some cheap water-based craft paint that I could brush on, rather than masking everything and using spray paint. This has the advantage of obviously not requiring any masking to be done, and you can see the little brush strokes in the finished model, which I guess is kind of cool to add to the scale realism. But this took way more coats than I originally thought it would, so it kind of ended up being a lot more of a pain to do than I would have thought, but eventually I had enough coats on there to get the result that you're seeing here. A nice dark blue color that I think pairs nicely with both the gray roof and the wooden interior, but some more hand painting was necessary for the windows and the trim. The garage itself is basically finished with all of the painting now done, so I can move on to adding the additional items, starting with the overhead door. There really isn't a ton of detail on these pieces, but I still went ahead and used a silver Sharpie to represent the rails that the door would use. Additional 1mm dowel pins can be used to help connect the rails to the center springs. If you're building one of these garage dioramas along with me, you can refer to this diagram here, which is included in the STL files. You should end up with something that looks like this. Pretty simple, all you have to do is glue the rails to the wall, but of course make sure that you don't glue the supports on the opposite end to the ceiling if you want to allow the roof to be removable. As for the pedestrian door on the opposite end of the garage, I used this pre-existing model that we have available. However, as you can see, it's only one-sided, so what I did was mirror this model, shortened it so it would fit, and created a spot on the back so that a clear plastic piece can be installed for the window. The door can easily be 3D printed in 2 halves and then glued together, with the window getting sandwiched inside. After sanding down the primer that I applied earlier to smooth the 3D print layers on the overhead door, I painted all of these pieces white. While waiting for that paint to dry, I measured and then cut 2 pieces of clear plastic to go in each of the windows. You can easily find thin sheets of clear plastic available, but sometimes you can even use something as simple as cutting up a piece of clear packaging that a product came in, basically reusing literal trash. I made sure to use some clear drying glue so there won't be any haze once it dries. After the paint dried on the doors, I did some final detail painting and installed the window. The pedestrian door can simply be glued to the back wall, while the magnets installed earlier on the overhead door help to hold it in place. With both of these doors installed, this garage is now complete. I'm extremely happy with how it turned out, especially considering how easy it was to make, with the 3D printer obviously doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. Not the most detailed diorama ever, but I had a lot of fun with it, and I think it's definitely going to look good sitting on the shelf. Like I said before, not every project needs to be my magnum opus. I'm just having some fun here and doing the best I can without driving myself crazy with the details. While I was overall very satisfied with this design, after having the experience of putting it together, I did go back and make a few minor tweaks here and there, just to improve it even more. So if you're interested in 3D printing and building one of these garage dioramas for yourself, you should have an even easier time putting everything together and have a slightly more refined design than what I showcased here. Obviously, if I was to build and design this garage again, there might be a few things here and there that I do a bit differently, but like I said, overall I'm very satisfied. One thing, however, that I'm not thrilled with how it turned out was this gap here between the roof piece and the walls. When I glued those 2 roof pieces together, it obviously wasn't perfectly level to the rest of the garage, so as a result of this, I got this unsightly gap that you see here. Obviously, when this diorama is indoors on a shelf, it's not going to be nearly as noticeable as it is here out in the sun. But other than that, I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I can move on to adding a bunch of accessories to start filling this garage up with a bunch of junk, just as you would expect. Now once again, I have to shout out both our Patreon and our store, shop.makeitrc.com, as we have a variety of different accessories for these types of 1/24th and 1/25th scale dioramas. Here you're seeing a selection of items that I had on hand, which I thought would look good in this particular diorama. Some of these are 3D printed, while some of these are accessories and other objects that were included in some of the plastic models that I've built. But in addition to all of this high-tech 3D printing, this extremely low-tech garden hose has once again made an appearance. As I've shown before, to make it, all you have to do is roll up some appropriately sized electrical wire, secure it with a zip tie, and I just used a silver Sharpie to paint the ends. For such a simple item to make, it really does help add some realism. Of course, the Revell 1980 Jeep J10 fits nicely inside, along with the included snowmobile. It looks like everything is going to fit in there nicely, but obviously some paint is going to be required on those 3D printed items. For convenience, I have included all of the 3D printable accessories that I'm using here in the STL files for this garage. Obviously though, feel free to use and arrange these objects or anything else you might have on hand in any way that you think looks the best. This is just an example of what I decided to include and how I decided to arrange everything. But once again, nothing fancy here when it comes to getting everything painted. I simply used some basic hardware store rattle cans to start, and then after that dried, I added some additional details where necessary by hand. Another extremely simple and low-budget item to add is saturating a small piece of paper towel with watered-down paint, an easy way to make something that looks like a rag, which I have sitting here on the bench. Now, I could spend hours and hours filling this garage with more and more junk, loading up these shelves, adding a bunch of random objects along the walls, but in an effort to try and get some videos out here on the channel on at least a somewhat regular basis, I'm not going to fully max out the scale details just yet. Believe me, I've got a lot more things I'd like to add, but I think what I'm going to do is spend some time working on this diorama over the coming months, and then make a follow-up video showcasing the additional stuff that I've added and any changes that I've made. I just don't want it to be another 6 months until I finally have this video ready, but even at this stage, I think it's definitely starting to look good. I did have some decals left over from a previous project, which I had simply printed onto some white sticker paper, and I thought they would look good here in this diorama. I'm sure I'll be adding some more signs and other stuff on the walls as well, but for now, this is where I'm going to leave it. Even at this stage, I'm really happy with how it looks. I've already been able to capture some great shots of some of my RC vehicles inside. Definitely a very fun little project that I think is going to look great up on the shelf and serve as a nice home for some of these vehicles, such as this Jeep J10. Just as I said at the beginning of this year, I wanted to do some more diorama projects, and this garage here has definitely helped scratch that itch. I'm looking forward to taking the detail even further by adding some additional items over time, but it's definitely off to a great start. While overall I am very happy with the design, a few things I might want to keep in mind for a future build is to consider incorporating some form of functional lighting, as well as try to mitigate any gap between the roof and the walls. Also, it would be kind of nice to be able to attach the overhead door not only in the closed position, but also have it in the up position. Even if it's not actually functional along the rails, just being able to have it in the up position rather than being removed entirely would be nice, just to add that little bit of extra realism. This could probably be accomplished quite easily by incorporating some additional magnets both in the door itself and also in the ceiling. I'm always trying to think ahead and make each project better than the last, but like I said, I'm very satisfied with how this one turned out. It's definitely not going to be a project that will appeal to those who really want to get in there and scratch build everything, but it's a nice one for those who want to lean more on the side of simplicity. As another bonus, it's also pretty budget friendly if you already have a 3D printer, as I don't think I quite used an entire roll printing all of these parts. I maybe used around $15 worth of PLA to get everything printed, so not bad, especially when compared to the price of hobby wood and sheets of styrene. But if you'd like to print one of these garage dioramas for yourself, the STL files can be found over on our Patreon, which I'll have linked below in the description. Of course, a huge thanks to all of our channel members and Patreon supporters. Your support not only helps make these videos possible, but also gives you access to some exclusive perks, such as STL files for projects like this one, as well as these functional RC chassis. I also want to give a huge thanks to each and every one of you for watching. I know these diorama projects are not everyone's cup of tea here on the channel, so if you enjoy these types of videos, a like and a share is always greatly appreciated. But that's all I've got for today. There's more cool stuff on the way, but until then, best of luck with all your projects, and I'll see you next time.